Hi, I'm Matt Easton and I'm here to answer your 5 questions. Thank you very much to everyone who posted on the Facebook page to give me ideas. There are a hell of a lot of questions there, but I'm just picking 5 more or less at random, and I'm going to go through those questions now in the most concise way possible, one by one. Thank you. So first up, Morton Bratlove asked about battle fatigue, PTSD, shell shock, these category of things, and their place in historical records and historical sources. And it is very conspicuous that when we look at historical sources beyond, further back than about World War One, we don't see many records of this sort of condition, and of essentially people suffering emotional trauma as a result of combat or having to take part in activities that were emotionally fatiguing or stressful. And actually, I'm gonna cop out slightly on this answer and say it's such a massive topic. I can't possibly answer it in one video, and I certainly can't answer it in one of these 5 question videos. But to my thinking, Lindy Beige, Lloyd, did a really good video on this topic, which I will link below this video here. And I think that he was brave to take on that topic because it is a mega big topic and also quite contentious. But in my view, I think he got it more or less right, and I think that when we look at historical periods and what we would describe as combat stress or PTSD, I think fundamentally it comes down to 2 things. Number one, historical sources tend not to record such things in a way that we would necessarily recognise. They certainly describe people doing irrational things. For example, Marshal Ney at the Battle of Waterloo is an example of someone who may have been suffering from combat stress. But also, it was something that wasn't spoken about. And famously, people who refused to fight in World War One were in some cases executed as cowards, as deserters, and it's pretty awful because some of those people, first of all, you shouldn't execute deserters, I wouldn't say, but certainly not in the modern world. But clearly, some of those people were suffering. They would have been recognised as suffering from psychological conditions that would have been treated, or at least they would have been taken care of today. So clearly in historical periods, when we go back to the 19th century and obviously further back into the medieval and ancient worlds, there was a stigma attached to this type of condition, and on one hand that meant that people wouldn't necessarily recognise it either in themselves or in other people, but equally you wouldn't write about it. There is another, so that's the first element, and I think the second element is that quite simply modern people who grew up in more modern societies, or should we say more developed societies as we would class them today, are less, I think they're more likely to suffer. I might be wrong, but I suspect that they're more likely to suffer combat stress and PTSD because our upbringings are very far removed from, for example, killing animals. In the medieval world, I think people lived more closely with life and death, both in animals and humans. A lot more people died of disease and died in childbirth and died as children than do now, or did even in the time of the First World War. But equally, I think that people are also more accustomed to things like hunting and butchering animals and things like this in more, I don't like the term primitive societies, but in less modern world societies or less developed world societies. So I think those are the 2 main things you have to look at, but there's a lot of complexities in this topic. I think partly it's because the historical record doesn't really record clearly the people who clearly did suffer PTSD or combat stress, and secondly, I think that possibly it was less likely to occur in individuals in, certainly from sort of maybe about the 17th century backwards, in the West at least, because of the nature of society and the way that people had slightly more gritty existences. So that was the first question. On to the second. So question number 2 comes from Michel Samuel Bargielowski maybe? I'm very bad at pronouncing, I guess that's a Polish name perhaps, but Michel says, or Michael I suspect, says, why, in your opinion, thrusting swords, such as rapiers and small swords, were more popular in Western Europe, while the rest of the world were using cutting swords, such as sabres, shamshirs, tulwars and katanas? Well, first up, that's not absolutely true, because if we actually think about it, in the time of the rapier, there were many other types of sword, so we're talking 16th, 17th century was the time of the rapier. There were many other types of sword that were in use. There were side swords, back swords, broadswords, falchions, early forms of cutlass, early to Europe forms of sabre. So there were many different types of swords in use at the time of the rapier. And then the same is true when we go to the time of the small sword. As I've got one behind me. Essentially the end of the 17th century and through the 18th century and into the beginning of the 19th century. In that time, of course, sabres, backswords, palashes, various types of cutting sword were in use, hangers and such like, were in use during that period, cutlasses of course. So first of all, we can't simply say that, you know, Europe converted to thrusting swords between the 16th century and the end of the 18th century. That's not true. These thrusting swords, so rapiers and small swords specifically, seem to have come about as a specialised, I won't say duelling weapon, but as a specialised one-on-one fighting weapon. So they seem to be very much optimised for fighting one opponent. That could be an organised duel, or it could be a sort of self-defence situation in the street. So the evolution in the appearance of the rapier and the small sword seem to be connected to a certain culture, first of all. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is, in the rest of the world used a mixture of cutting and thrusting and cut and thrust swords. For example, India is famous for the tulwar. I'll just grab one here. There we go. There's one. I'm not sure I've ever shown this one on screen before. This is actually my wife's tulwar. The hilt's a little bit small for my hand, and she liked it and basically took it off me. But anyway, India is famous for the talwar or tulwar. And other types of cutting swords, such as the kanda, for example. So not only curved, the tulwar might be curved, and the tulwar probably stemmed from the Mughals, so essentially Islamic and Persian influence, and through Afghanistan and such like. The native, shall we say native Indian swords, at least the earlier period Indian swords, actually split into two main groups. They split down into broadswords, essentially like kandars, so either one-edged or two-edged, but usually straight and quite broad. And on the other hand, swords that are curved forwards, so a bit like a giant kukri, a bit like a kora. India had different types of swords at different times, and it did have thrusting swords, thrusting specific swords as well. Now, the context of use of those thrusting swords in India is beyond my sphere of knowledge, unfortunately, but just to say that there were thrusting swords in other parts of the world also. If we look at China, they've got the Chinese type of dao or sabre, sometimes called a Chinese broadsword in modern martial arts use, which I think is a rubbish term for it. But dao, as I understand it, means something similar to langmesser actually. I think it means large knife or something like that. But they also had the straight sword, the straight jan, the straight double-edged sword, which actually is pretty much like a European straight double-edged sword, and it's fairly narrow, and as I understand it, from friends of mine who do Chinese swordsmanship, used very largely to thrust. Used to cut as well, but it is nevertheless used to thrust quite a lot. So it's not like Europeans specialised in thrusting swords and the rest of the world specialised in cutting swords. However, what I will say is there is a question lurking in there which I think is completely valid, and that is why did some cultures at some times go with dedicated thrusting swords, whilst other cultures at other times, or sometimes even the same culture at the same time, also used cutting swords, sometimes curved, sometimes straight. And I think the simple answer is, if, for example, we look at the late 18th century, the Napoleonic era, The really dedicated thrusting swords, small swords, by that point were really only used for duelling and as dress swords. Okay, so that tells you something. Sailors were given broad chopping swords that could also thrust with a big handguard, a cutlass. Okay, cavalrymen were given a sword that was fairly broad, long, of course, and could cut and thrust and had good hand protection. So very clearly, certain swords are better at certain jobs than others. If you're walking about town and you might get into a duel, you might get into one-on-one fight, a rapier or a small sword is good. If you're riding around on horseback, aiming to fight other people on horseback and people on foot and pursuing fleeing opponents, then clearly a cut and thrust sword with good hand protection is a good idea. If you're fighting on a ship, then a cutlass is clearly a good idea. Good hand protection, shorter blade, good, a lot of chopping power, but also good for thrusting. It's a bit like a gladius with a handguard, really. So clearly, context is the answer. Different swords are better for different things. And it's not like Europeans just all went for thrusting swords. It's not true. In the period of, you could say, if you look at the English Civil War, for example, in the 1640s, whilst rapiers absolutely were the most common gentleman's wearing sword about town, and some soldiers and officers did wear rapiers in a military environment, the predominant military swords in the English Civil War in the 1640s were hangers, pretty much like a cutlass, or back swords and broadswords, so basically cavalry swords. So and they were both cut and thrust swords. I think it comes down to, if you're fighting one-on-one, a dedicated thrusting sword makes a lot of sense. For certain types of cavalry, so if you're looking at armour penetration or using it like a short lance, so the 1908 pattern British cavalry sword as one example, the Patton American cavalry sword is another example, or the Polish koncers, I don't know how to pronounce it, which is essentially an estoc for thrusting through armour, is another example. So particular use of thrusting swords. But for most general use, you want a cut and thrust sword. If you might be fighting multiple opponents, you might be fighting on horse, you might be fighting on a ship, you might be fighting on foot, you might be fighting in a forest, you might be fighting in a desert, you know, kind of a general purpose sword, you want it to be of medium length, that can cut and can thrust and hopefully has hand protection, unless you use a shield and then it doesn't really need hand protection so much. So that's question 2. On to question 3. So question 3. Jacob Bjorno Klunder says, how much difference does the quality of the steel really make for an edged weapon? Can we make weapons that are vastly superior with our current techniques compared to, say, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, or the Napoleonic era? Well, first up to say, I think there are 2 main points in that question. One is, how much difference does steel quality really make to a sword? Let's just limit it to swords for this. I could expand it to knives and spears and maces and whatever, but I think the question is mostly about swords. And the second question is about period. Now, I'm actually going to address the period question first. So Jacob mentioned 3 periods: Middle Ages, Renaissance, that's kind of fuzzy because they connect, and Napoleonic era, which is a jump forward. Now, the first thing to say is that in the 17th century, metallurgy was quite a bit more advanced than, in generally speaking, the average level of metallurgy was quite a bit further forward than, for example, the 14th century. Okay, so if we say 17th century is kind of, I know people argue about what's Renaissance. I think most people would say that Renaissance starts sometime in the 15th century and ends at some point in the 17th century. But anyway, if we take 14th century, 17th century, and then beginning of the 19th century, there's quite a big difference between the metallurgy there. Without a shadow of a doubt, it was possible to mass produce high carbon steel for things like swords and gun barrels and other things, and even, you know, girders to make bridges and stuff. It was far more possible to do that in the beginning of the 19th century than it was in the 17th century, and basically it was impossible to mass produce steel in the 14th century. It's one of the reasons that armour development moved so quickly between the 13th century and the 15th century, was because their ability to make large steel plates of fairly consistent quality improved a lot. during that period. And by the 17th century, of course, we're getting the beginning of sort of factory processes coming in, and really large buildings dedicated to producing large amounts of metal of all sorts. So first thing you have to recognise is that if we go into the late 19th century, for example, like some of the swords that I've got, so these are mid-19th century, yeah, most of these are mid-19th century, they were using a steel that was essentially very similar to modern steels that are available. So, for example, if we take one sword off the wall here, this is made by Wilkinson in about 1860, this sword, so it's a cavalry, a British cavalry sword from about 1860, and this is made to a very specific formula for Wilkinson, the steel of the blade, and in fact the formula still survives. You can find it online. I've actually put it on my sword selling website, Eastern Antique Arms, and it's completely replicable in the modern world, and it's I would say equivalent to modern steels that are available, and their heat treatment was it wasn't quite as precise as modern heat treatment, but what they did was they failure tested all swords. So there are essentially two ways of guaranteeing quality. You either do it to a very precise scientific process every single time, or you do it to as close as you can get to a scientific process every time, and then you test the end result. And what Wilkinson did is they would make, you know, let's say a number, 100, they would make 100 blades, and then they would test them all, and the 50 that failed they'd throw away, and they'd only keep the ones that passed. So that's one way of, you know, using quality control is one way of essentially getting the end product to be of good enough quality. However, that steel which was made for them in Sheffield to an exact formula could not have been consistently produced in the 18th century. In that 100 years there was a big advancement in the quality of steel. So to come back to the original question about a sword and whether the quality of the steel makes a huge difference. I think it's an interesting point actually, and I think that one of the important things to note is that until a sword fails, it kind of doesn't matter how good the steel is. Let me qualify that slightly. If we assign a percentage to quality and we say that we can make a modern sword that is 100% good. Now let's say that in the medieval period they could consistently make a sword that was 75% good. So long as 75% good does the job, then there's nothing lacking between that extra 25%. So long as your sword doesn't break or bend or blunt too easily, then it's still a functional sword. And you know, a little comparison is, you know, Albions, for example. Everyone knows Albions are very good quality. Everyone knows that something like cold steel, for example, are not such good quality. However, if I take a cold steel sword and fight with it and beat my opponent, then it's done its job. So I think there's two parts to answering this question. I think first of all, yes, it's very true that medieval swords metallurgically were not as consistent, both in terms of heat treatment and in terms of the actual steel itself, so they couldn't precisely govern the amount of carbon content and sulfur and phosphorus and manganese and all the other things in there, and they couldn't precisely predict the results of their heat treatment. They would probably do what Wilkinson did later. They would make some swords and they would test each one and find out whether it failed or passed. There is in fact an 18th century, I think it's 18th century text, I think it's a fencing treatise actually, but it could be Girard, but I can't remember who advises it, and they say if you're buying a small sword, in the sword seller's shop you should put the point into the wall, presumably a wooden wall, and just push it until it's bent, bowed, and then retract it again and check that it goes to straight. So there's a really simple way if you're buying a sword for checking that the heat treatment's good. If a blade bends and then comes back to straight without taking any set to it, then first of all you know it's not too brittle because it flexed, and secondly you know that it's not too soft because it returned to true. So I think yes, Victorian swords were on average better quality metallurgically than medieval swords. Funnily enough, if we look at the kind of 17th century, the period of rapiers, I suspect that if you took 100 rapiers and 100 mass-produced cavalry swords from the 19th century, you might find that metallurgically the rapiers are actually slightly better than the mass-produced cavalry swords of the 19th century. But that's for a different reason. It's not because in the 19th century they couldn't make them better, it's because they were mass-producing things, and very often things were contracted to companies and they churned out swords for as cheap as possible. So an example, I'll just grab one here, is a type of cutlass that was made from 1845 onwards, and then the Royal Navy, the British government, decided to alter this type of cutlass, alter the shape of the point slightly, shorten it and change the shape of the point. And when they did this, it was done in a slightly haphazard way, with the result that lots of these swords ended up with being too soft in the tip. So when they were thrust into things, they would bend and stay bent. And clearly that's not very good. So they then had to send all the swords back and have them tested again. And if they passed the test, then they were stamped as having passed the test, and that they were springy and hard enough. So there's all sorts of things at play. I would just finish up by saying, technically, yes, we can make a better sword in the modern world, I think, than has ever been made historically, because we have new types of alloy steel available to us, we have very precise heat treatment, and we're still able to do exactly what the ancients did, and that's when we've made our sword, test it and see whether it works or not. And if it doesn't work perfectly, then we can tweak that, change the heat treatment slightly, change the balance of chemicals in the steel slightly. So yes, science has moved on. Making swords essentially is science, and trial and error, but that's part of science. And so yes, technically we can make a better sword today. Where I won't say where most, but where a lot of sword makers fall down in the modern world is not necessarily the quality of the steel or the quality of the heat treatment. It's their understanding of what makes a good sword in the hand and for use and for fighting with. And so they get, the nodes of resonance, or the centre of percussion, or the shape of the grip, or the distal taper and the way that the blade flexes in the thrust. They get those things slightly wrong. And that's where the medieval and Renaissance people had the big advantage. They didn't have an advantage in metallurgy, but where they did have an advantage was knowing how to use a frickin' sword and what it was for. And that's what we don't have today. We know how M60s and SA80s and Colt 1911s work perfectly, but the modern world is not that great at understanding how swords are supposed to work. Right, on to the next question. Right, next two questions I'm going to keep fairly short because I've waffled on for easily long enough already. So Gary W. Hodges says, I don't know if someone's already covered this, but how survivable were combat injuries in medieval times? Not just serious injuries to organs, which I assume would be fatal, yeah, but even minor injuries to extremities in an era without antibiotics. Well, I think the short answer is that definitely, just like animals in the wild, people living in more primitive societies try to avoid minor injuries, especially ones which break the skin, for exactly the reason hinted at there, that if you get an infection, basically that could be you dead. And this is something which I think a lot of people need to be reminded of in HEMA when we take incidental little hits. You might think, oh well, that wouldn't have stopped me fighting. No, it wouldn't, but it may have killed you 1 month down the line. We know from skeletal evidence and written documents, when I say skeletal evidence I mean skeletons from the ground dug up by archaeologists, as I've done in my past, and from text, that sometimes people receive quite minor injuries and lingered for a while, as is often described, and then died. And it could be something like concussion, it could be internal bleeding, it could be infection, it could be a broken bone that doesn't set properly and then it goes nasty, and all sorts of reasons for dying, as well as disease and other things. So yeah, quite simply, small injuries could lead to death in the long run. But I would only caveat that by saying some hard bastards historically, equally from the skeletal evidence and from documents and from texts, we know that some people got quite nasty injuries, lost a limb, had an amputation, whatever, got run through, and did survive. So it did happen. But there was an awful lot of luck involved. I know one example of, well, there's several examples from the Towton battlefield where people have got old injuries. I think there's one, if I remember correctly, who's had part of his scalp cut off, but then the bone has grown back. So clearly it was an earlier battle injury, probably from a sword or something similar, a large knife or something. And so, yeah, sometimes absolutely people did heal, and sometimes particularly monasteries had quite, for the time, quite advanced levels of medicinal treatment, with poultices and keeping things clean and all this kind of stuff. They sometimes managed to patch people up enough that they recovered. But we should also not forget that in the modern world, when we recover from an injury, unless it's something like a landmine or something, most civilians, shall I say, who recover from an injury, there's not usually necessarily any external sign that we've had that injury. Whereas in the medieval world, if you had a broken leg, probably your leg would never be right again. Absolutely, you could put a splint on that broken leg and you could get the leg working again, but you're probably always having a limp. You might always suffer from degrees of infection and ailments connected to that. The bone might not be straight, all sorts of problems. So yeah, quite simply, very easy to be debilitated by injuries in the medieval period, absolutely. On to the next question. So final question comes from that I'm picking. There are lots of other good questions here, incidentally, and some of them I may actually devote an entire video to some of these questions. If there's a question you think, why didn't Matt answer that because it was really popular, it might be because it's so big that I can't fit it into one of these 5 question videos, and I will keep a note of it and make a full video about it at some point. But Elijah Talmud says, I've seen swords with one quillon and a finger ring. Were those used in a style similar to later sabres, or were they used like plain Jane arming swords? Well, Elijah, I'm not 100% sure which swords you're referring to. I know there's in the Doge's Palace in Venice, there is a sort of backsword that has a knuckle bow and a finger ring. You might be thinking of that one. But the answer is the same for whether you're talking about that or whether you're talking about swords which I would call side swords, which is a modern term, but it's a useful term to differentiate between arming swords and rapiers. Side swords sort of sit in the middle. And side swords often just have like an arming sword crossguard and then either one, sometimes one, the earlier ones tend to have one finger ring, and then the slightly later ones have 2 finger rings. And these start to appear in the 15th century, and this is something that I don't think a lot of people realise, is that swords like the ones shown in Marozzo, so Marozzo's fencing treatise of 1536, we tend to refer to that as a side sword treatise because the sword that he predominantly uses is what most people today would know as a side sword. And what is a side sword? It's essentially an arming sword with a relatively longer and narrower blade than most arming swords of the 15th century. It tends to be a Type 19 blade for any Oakshott fans out there. So it tends to be a little bit longer and narrower than a typical arming sword, and tends to have some form of slightly more developed handguard, sometimes a knuckle bow, very often at least 1 finger ring and very often 2 finger rings. Marozzos are from memory, the 1536 just have 2 finger rings that I don't think they have a knuckle bow. How are they used? The short answer, this is a very long, if you look up Ilkka Hartikanen's YouTube channel, you can find lots of stuff about Bolognese, that's as in from Bologna. So you look up Marozzo, Manciolino, Anonimo, Bolognese, Dallagocchi, all of these sources, Vigiani, they all use this type of sword. So it's the link between medieval arming sword and later rapier stuff. And it's a cut and thrust sword. How was it used? It was essentially used, as you would expect, it's kind of halfway between later rapier stuff and earlier arming sword / Langmesser stuff. So the footwork is passing footwork, it's not like Sabre. Sabre, you keep your dominant foot forward and you lunge and recover. They do have lunges in the side sword material, but most of the footwork is passing footwork, where the left and right foot are continually passing around, much like in longsword or Langmesser. We see the lunge and recover footwork start to come in with later rapier, and then it becomes absolutely the main type of footwork with small sword and later backsword material, and therefore of course stays right the way through to Sabre. So how was it used? It was used essentially a bit like a one-handed longsword, but having said that, or caveat that, there are some some techniques in there in sidesword stuff that are basically the same or very similar to rapier stuff, and some of them happen to be the same as sabre stuff. But by and large, I would say the main difference is, someone said to me, in short, Matt, what's the difference between sidesword and sabre? I'd say there's two main things. One, sabre, you keep the dominant foot forward and you lunge and recover, so extend the front foot out and come back. In sidesword, you pass feet predominantly. That's the first big difference, the footwork. And the second big difference is the way you use the sword. In sabre, because you've got a nice big handguard, you hold the weapon out in front of you and you block and riposte, block, riposte, block, riposte, block, riposte. Whereas in sidesword, sometimes you do that. So there are times, guardi di faccia and entrare and all of these guards, and where you do just block and riposte. You do have that in sidesword, but additionally you have counter-cutting and counter-striking as well, which you don't really have in sabre, or at least you don't have in the Western European sabre stuff. So for example, if a cut's coming down here, so a cut number one's coming down the side of my head, instead of just guard and riposte, you'll often have movements which are more like a beat. So I'll actually hit into the person's blade and then cut around from it. So another example, if the cut's coming down here, is I might beat underneath it. So this would be a rabat in Fiore, which we do with longsword. So it's similar to longsword in that sense. So it's often about beating an opponent's blade offline and then coming back in. So there's more motion moving the sword around like this all of the time. Why? Well, partly because that's how the older systems use swords by themselves predominantly. Partly it's to do with hand protection. You might say, why did they ever change from that? Well, you could say that once basket hilted swords came in, broadswords and backswords, you've now got something that's essentially like a buckler for your hand. So you can now just stick that out there, and it simplifies. It's very easy to defend, very easy to riposte, and you don't have to worry about being hit in the hand. With a side sword, your hand's a lot more exposed, like with a medieval arming sword, and so you don't really want to just stand with the hand out in front of you the whole time, because you're just going to spend the whole time getting hit in the hand, which, as we've discussed, in the medieval and Renaissance period is not good. Okay, there we go. That was the 5 questions. Thank you very much. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.